As the 21st century unfolds, it is becoming more and more evident that the major problems of our time, energy, the environment, climate change, food security, financial security, cannot be understood in isolation. They are systematic problems, which means that they are all interconnected and interdependent. Ultimately, these problems must be seen as just different facets of one single crisis, which is largely a crisis of perception. It derives from the fact that most people in our modern society, and especially our large social institutions, subscribe to the concepts of an outdated worldview, a perception of reality inadequate for dealing with our globally interconnected world. That was a quote from this book, The System's View of Life, by Future Capra and Pierluigi Luisi. And I think they recognize something very profound here. Now, all of us are of course aware of these global problems. That's nothing new. But this deeper and maybe more personal problem that lies beneath those things certainly often goes unnoticed. And it may well be that it is exactly this deeper problem that must be first solved before we can even begin to solve these larger global crises. But what is this deeper crisis? As we heard, Capra and Luisi call it the crisis of perception, which is a very apt name in my opinion, but there is also the names meta-crisis, or maybe the most famous one is the meaning crisis, coined by John Vervaeke.
We are in the midst of a mental health crisis. There are increases in anxiety disorders, depression, despair. Suicide rates are going up in North America, parts of Europe, other parts of the world. And that mental health crisis is itself due to and engaged with crises in the environment, in the political system, and those in turn are enmeshed within a deeper cultural historical crisis I call the meaning crisis. These problems are deep problems that we're facing. Many people are talking about the meaning crisis, but what I want to argue is that these problems are deeper than just social media problems, political problems, even economic problems. They're deeply historical, cultural, cognitive problems, and we need to penetrate into them carefully and rigorously.
So according to Vervaeke, the symptoms of the meaning crisis or the crisis of perception include feelings of meaninglessness, cynicism, lack of trust, nihilism, depression, confusion, indifference, and feelings of being stuck. So not only the global problems seem to be stuck and lie unresolved, also our personal lives, for many of us, seem to be stuck. So it's very important to recognize this deep connection between our personal problems and with these public global issues. They are part of the same problem, and that problem is our current worldview. The problem lies in our current way of understanding our experience and even our current way to perceive the world and ourselves. So in order to solve these global problems, we have to first look into ourselves. Inspired by this deep crisis of perception, I'm launching this new series called Musing Sense. In this series, I intend to begin to solve this crisis of perception by providing some light into a new kind of worldview, which I have named for the time being semiotism. Now, semiotism is not an ideology, but a concept that is intended to name a whole epoch, like the concepts modernism or postmodernism. To quickly summarize this series, we are going to think how to think about thinking. It is ultimately a reflective project where we are trying to learn new ways of perceiving and understanding our experience. The aim of the series is to better understand and recognize the ways you are inferring and rationalizing things in order that we could better criticize those ways. In other words, we are going to make sense of our sense making. So, why then call this series Musing Sense and not Making Sense? Well, this has to do with the new worldview, which I have named Semiotism. In order to better understand this, we have to quickly discuss how we got here in the first place, starting with modernism. Needless to say, we're going to paint with a very broad brush here. To start off with, it's a very modern thing to say that we make sense. The modern era of enlightenment saw the individual human or the individual subject as the sole source of rationality. And the task of these rational individuals was to bring reason into being and lighten the dark irrationality of the world and nature. Hence the name Enlightenment. The ultimate task of humankind was to bring order and sense into this chaotic and savage nature and world. Humankind was destined to make sense. Then came the postmoderns, who saw this modern sense-making project as being arrogant, to say the least. Actually, they went much further than that and claimed that it was imperialist and destructive project. The idea of this rational individual or rational subject became heavily criticized. After the discoveries of subconsciousness and the ways how deeply culture, norms, beliefs and stories shape not only our behavior but even the way we perceive the world, it became increasingly difficult to argue that we could completely master ourselves, be completely self-transparent and be completely rational. So therefore the postmoderns claimed that we could not possibly make sense. And as these cultural norms, stories and narratives are merely social constructs and therefore just historical, accidental and coincidental things, the idea of truth was also compromised. So, according to the postmoderns, there is no one objective truth. There is just different ways of seeing and conceptualizing the world. There are just different stories, and there is no way to say that one story is more truthful than some other story. And that's why this rationality that we felt so intuitive, that is so self-evident what it means to be rational, is also just an illusion. Therefore, according to the postmoderns, we don't make sense, we make up sense. Now, Peirce turns these things around. It may be best understood as a new Copernican revolution. Just as the moderns shook the medieval world by discovering that the Earth was not the center of the universe, but rather just a part of it, Peirce shook the modern world by discovering that we were not the center of rationality, but just a part of it. In other words, we are not the source of rationality. Rather, the world is already rational and we participate with that rationality. So, we don't make sense like the moderns thought, and we don't make up sense like the postmoderns thought. Rather, we muse sense. So, what does this mean in more practical terms? When we rationalize something, we don't make sense, meaning that we don't perceive something completely chaotic and irrational and then attach rationality on top of it. Rationality does not originate solely inside from our minds to be then attached to the chaotic world around us. We don't invent sense, we discover it. Let's take an example. When something surprising happens, you stop what you're doing and you start to actively perceive your surroundings. You're trying to find an explanation, you're trying to make sense of what just happened. Now, that explanation does not emerge solely from your mind, neither is it uploaded directly into your mind by the environment. Rather, the explanation emerges through an interaction between you and your environment. The explanation emerged through an inferential process that included both you and your environment. Furthermore, this inferential process proceeded through science, which brings us to the worldview of semiotism, the view that at the bottom of things, the very foundation of reality, is an action of science, a process of science, or what we may call semiosis. Let's bring this even closer to our everyday experience. Now, in terms of a practical attitude, this means that we cannot simply impose pre-learned patterns or behaviors into our environment, because that would be rationalizing with only our minds and not taking account the environment. Rather, to be rational, we must perceive our environment, actively experience our environment. So, as a practical attitude, we must be open to our experience. We have to be sensitive to the world now experience and listen to the world and let it tell us its reasons. This is a change in the way we think about thinking. Thinking is not something that happens solely in your brain. It is not something that happens in this kind of container that we understand as the mind. Rather, your brain or your mind is participating with the world when it infers and rationalizes or simply experience anything. So we are not the creators of meaning or sense, rather we are the mediators or amplifiers of meaning and sense that is already there in the world. This means that the world is not a meaningless, irrational and chaotic place, but on the contrary, full of meaning, ready to be participated with. The only thing we must do is open our eyes to that meaning and start to participate with it. Now, this of course sounds very banal and it's a cliche, I know, but it's not that simple because it requires a paradigmatic shift in our ways of perceiving, experiencing and understanding the world and our experience. So, to summarize all of this, we must stop to make sense and start musing sense. See you in the next video.